Hey guys, tonight we begin with a place people imagine as endless luxury, idle pleasure, and absolutely no consequences, which is impressive because it was actually one of the most politically dangerous rooms on Earth. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. The Ottoman Harem might be the most misunderstood institution in history, which is impressive considering history has spent centuries misunderstanding absolutely everything. Mention the word haram, and most people immediately picture silk cushions, lounging women, and a life of luxurious boredom, punctuated by dramatic fainting. In other words, a Renaissance painting that has never met reality and isn't particularly interested in doing so. The truth is much less exciting in the way movies hate, and much more exciting in the way politics loves. The harem was not a pleasure palace. It was an administrative machine, a carefully regulated, tightly supervised environment attached directly to the core of imperial power. If it helps, imagine a government office, but with fountains, etiquette rules, and significantly higher stakes for making the wrong comment at the wrong time. Nothing inside the haram was casual, not movement, not conversation, not even silence. Silence itself had rank. Everyone knew who outranked whom, who was watching, and who had absolutely too much free time and an excellent memory for mistakes. A large part of the confusion comes from European observers who saw something unfamiliar and immediately assumed moral collapse. The idea that women could exist near political power without chaos offended them on a spiritual level. So they wrote about decadence instead. Travel diaries became gossip columns. Gossip became scholarship, and scholarship became confident nonsense. But the Ottomans were under no illusions. The harem existed to control access, manage succession, and reduce instability. It was designed to prevent scandal, not produce it. Ironically, this is precisely why it generated so much intrigue. When you put ambitious, intelligent people next to power and tell them to be quiet forever, they do not become peaceful. They become strategic. Very few women in the harem ever met the Sultan in private. Even fewer stayed relevant long enough to matter. Beauty faded. Intelligence endured. Memory was currency. Timing was everything. And mistakes were remembered with the kind of dedication normally reserved for family grudges. The real scandal isn't that the Ottoman harem was full of intrigue. The real scandal is that people thought it was about pleasure. It wasn't. It was about control, patience, and survival with better curtains. And wherever that combination exists, history stops being polite and starts being interesting. Contrary to popular imagination, women did not simply wander into the Ottoman Harem because someone thought they looked good in silk. This was not an open casting call. It was a highly controlled intake system run with the enthusiasm of a bureaucracy and the subtlety of a locked door. Women entered the harem through several routes, none of which involved a dramatic romantic backstory. Some were captives from war. Some were purchased through legal slave markets. Some were sent as diplomatic gifts, because nothing says we respect your empire like carefully selected human beings. This may sound harsh, but it was entirely normal by the standards of the time, which is history's way of saying, don't apply modern logic unless you enjoy headaches. Once inside, however, the story changed. The harem did not operate on chaos or indulgence. It operated on sorting. New arrivals were evaluated immediately. Intelligence, temperament, memory, adaptability, and discipline mattered far more than appearance. Beauty was common, competence was not, and competence was what kept you alive and relevant. Most women would never meet the Sultan ever. They were assigned roles, duties, and ranks, and many lived quiet lives, serving higher-ranking women or managing internal tasks. Think less constant intrigue and more high-stakes boarding school, where mistakes follow you forever. The idea that every woman in the harem was competing for the Sultan's attention is one of the greatest myths ever produced by bored outsiders. In reality, drawing attention too early was dangerous. Attention meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant expectations. And expectations had a nasty habit of turning into punishments. The system was designed to observe before rewarding. Women were trained for years before any possibility of advancement. They learned language, religion, etiquette, music, and silence. Especially silence. Saying the wrong thing could be worse than saying nothing at all. And here's the part that ruins most fantasies. Many women preferred not to rise. Advancement came with risk. Visibility attracted rivals. Rivals attracted accusations. Accusations attracted consequences. Remaining useful but unnoticed was often the safest strategy. The harem did not reward impulse. It rewarded patience. It did not celebrate ambition. It tested it. And it certainly did not forgive mistakes just because someone was charming. Entry into the harem was not the beginning of indulgence. It was the beginning of surveillance. And in a system where everyone was watching everyone else, the smartest move was often to look like you weren't playing the game at all. Once a woman entered the Ottoman harem, the fantasy of idle luxury ended immediately, if it ever existed at all. What followed was not indulgence, but education. Relentless, structured, and quietly unforgiving education. The harem did not produce ornaments. It produced people who could function under pressure without visibly panicking, which, historically speaking, is a rare and valuable skill. New arrivals were trained in languages first: Ottoman, Turkish, Arabic, Persian, because nothing says imperial sophistication like being multilingual while pretending you're not listening to conversations happening across the room. Then came religion, etiquette, poetry, music, calligraphy, history, and court protocol. Not because these were hobbies, but because ignorance in the harem was dangerous. If you misunderstood a rule, you didn't get corrected gently. You got remembered. Education wasn't about self-expression. It was about control, knowing exactly when to speak, when to bow, when to remain perfectly still, and when to disappear emotionally from a room was a survival skill. The most educated women weren't the loudest or most impressive. They were the ones no one noticed making mistakes ever. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Intelligence was a threat, a useful threat, but a threat nonetheless. The harem valued cleverness only when it came wrapped in obedience. Too much ambition, too visible a mind, and suddenly tutors stopped praising you and started monitoring you, which is palace language for we are concerned. Music and poetry weren't taught for romance. They were taught because they revealed discipline. Anyone could learn a melody. Very few could perform it flawlessly under observation without revealing nerves. That mattered. Court life rewarded people who could remain graceful while being evaluated like livestock with better posture. Memory was perhaps the most important skill of all. Who outranked whom? Who favored whom? Who had offended whom 3 years ago and pretended it never happened? The harem ran on memory, and forgetting was often worse than ignorance. Forgetting meant you hadn't been paying attention, and not paying attention was how people vanished quietly. Education was the first filter. Those who adapted survived. Those who didn't were reassigned, sidelined, or quietly removed from relevance. The system did not shout. It did not need to. By the time a woman advanced, she had already been shaped by years of observation and correction. She knew the rules. She knew the risks. And most importantly, she knew that knowledge itself was power, as long as you pretended it wasn't. Because in the Ottoman Harem, education wasn't about learning. It was about learning not to be obvious. In the Ottoman Harem, attention was not affection. It was not romance. It was not validation. Attention was currency. Unstable, highly valuable currency that could appreciate overnight or collapse without warning. And like all dangerous currencies, it ruined people who misunderstood it. The Sultan's attention did not mean you were special. It meant you were visible, and visibility inside the harem was a double-edged blade that everyone pretended not to notice while carefully stepping around it. A single glance, a brief conversation, an invitation to perform music or poetry. These moments were noticed by everyone: who stood nearby, who was absent, who reacted too quickly, who smiled too widely. The harem had no privacy in the modern sense. Everything happened in front of witnesses who remembered details with alarming dedication. Receiving attention too early was risky. Attention created expectations. Expectations created pressure. Pressure created mistakes. And mistakes had consequences that did not come with second chances. The smartest women understood this and did something deeply counterintuitive. They avoided attention, or at least they delayed it. Remaining useful but unremarkable was often the safest position. Manage tasks well, speak when required, perform competently, not brilliantly. Excellence was dangerous. Perfection attracted rivals. Rivals attracted scrutiny. Scrutiny attracted trouble. When attention did arrive, it had to be managed carefully. Too much warmth invited jealousy. Too much distance suggested ingratitude. Too much emotion suggested instability. The correct response was somewhere between grateful restraint and dignified calm. A balance so precise that missing it by a fraction could change everything. And once attention faded, because it always did, the fall could be brutal. Favor was temporary. The harem never allowed anyone to forget that a woman who had once been summoned regularly could find herself waiting indefinitely, surrounded by people who remembered her former status, with thin smiles and perfect manners. The most dangerous moment wasn't receiving attention. It was losing it, because loss signaled weakness, and weakness invited replacement. This constant rise and fall created a culture of extreme self-control. Emotions were hidden. Reactions were delayed. Triumph was muted. Disappointment was swallowed whole. The harem rewarded those who could remain unreadable, not because they felt nothing, but because showing it was expensive. Attention in the Ottoman harem was not a reward. It was an investment, and every investment came with risk. Those who survived longest weren't the ones who received the most attention. They were the ones who knew exactly how much they could afford to receive. In many royal courts, having a child, especially a son, was considered protection. In the Ottoman harem, it was more like activating hard mode. Motherhood didn't bring peace. It brought attention, expectation, and a spotlight so bright it exposed every possible weakness. When a woman gave birth to a son, she didn't become safe. She became relevant, and relevance inside the harem was dangerous. A prince was not just a child. He was a future problem waiting to grow up. Every son represented a potential claim to the throne, and multiple claims had a long, proud history of ending in bloodshed. The Ottomans were painfully aware of this, which is why succession was treated less like a celebration and more like a controlled explosion that everyone hoped wouldn't go off too early. For the mother, this meant a permanent shift in status. She gained rank, resources, and visibility. but she also gained rivals, other mothers, other factions, other people smiling politely while calculating how inconvenient her child might become in the future. From that moment on, motherhood became political labor. Mothers had to secure allies, manage appearances, and carefully shape their son's reputation from an early age. A prince who appeared too ambitious was threatening. A prince who appeared too passive was expendable. Finding the perfect balance between capable and harmless required constant adjustment, like raising a child while also writing their resume for a job that involved ruling an empire. And the danger didn't come only from other women. Officials, tutors, military figures, and court factions all had opinions about which prince would be best. Best in this case usually meant most useful to us. Mothers had to navigate these interests carefully, ensuring support without appearing manipulative. A delicate task, especially when everyone assumed manipulation anyway. Even worse, motherhood made loss more painful and more public. If a prince fell ill, everyone noticed. If he died, everyone reassessed. Grief was expected, but too much grief was suspicious. Too little was also suspicious. There was no correct emotional response, only incorrect ones. The cruel irony is that the very thing that elevated a woman's position also chained her future to forces she couldn't control. Her status rose with her son, but so did the risks. She could do everything right and still lose everything overnight. In the Ottoman Harem, motherhood was not a refuge. It was a battlefield with smaller uniforms, and once you stepped onto it, there was no retreat. At the very top of the Ottoman Harem sat one woman who did not compete, did not scramble, and did not need to prove anything to anyone. The Vali Sultan, the Sultan's mother. If the harem was a battlefield, she was the general who no longer needed armor because everyone already knew what she could do. Her authority was absolute inside the harem and quietly influential outside it. She controlled rank, discipline, allowances, appointments, punishments, and access. She decided who advanced, who stalled, and who suddenly found themselves reassigned to a much quieter palace with excellent scenery and absolutely no relevance. Officially, the valid sultan was not running the empire. Unofficially, many people adjusted their political plans based on whether she approved of them. Grand Vizier learned quickly that ignoring her opinion was a bold move, usually followed by a short career. She didn't rule through shouting or dramatic displays. That would have been undignified. Instead, she ruled through routine, through paperwork, through habits, through the simple ability to say no, and have that no quietly echoed through the palace until it became reality. And the most terrifying part, she didn't need to move against you directly. If the valid sultan disapproved of someone, doors stopped opening. Invitations stopped arriving. Support faded. allies drifted away. By the time the target realized something was wrong, they were already irrelevant. Other women in the harem understood this perfectly. You did not challenge the Valides sultan. You did not test her patience. You did not attempt clever maneuvers unless you were absolutely certain she approved, or was at least distracted by something more important. Even mothers of princes deferred to her. Rank did not outweigh experience, and experience in this environment meant having survived long enough to watch entire generations rise and fall while you remained seated. The Valida Sultan also controlled information. She knew who spoke too much, who listened too carefully, and who pretended not to hear anything at all. She did not need spies in the dramatic sense. She had routines, and routines reveal everything. If scandals erupted, she managed them. If tensions grew dangerous, she redirected them. Stability mattered, not because she was sentimental, but because chaos threatened the system that kept her powerful. In the Ottoman Harem, ambition burned hot and fast. The Valid Sultan burned slow, and in a place where everyone was afraid of disappearing, she was the one presence that never did. If you imagine the Ottoman Harem as a place where women competed individually, you're only seeing half the game. Survival was rarely a solo effort. The real power came from alliances, quiet, flexible, and deniable alliances formed behind curtains across courtyards and through people who officially had nothing to do with politics. No one announced these alliances. There were no oaths, no dramatic handshakes, no "we ride at dawn" speeches. That would have been reckless. Instead, alliances formed through shared routines, favors, and carefully remembered kindnesses. A recommendation here, a warning there. An introduction made at the right moment and forgotten publicly 5 minutes later. Servants were the glue that held everything together. They carried messages, observed moods, and noticed patterns long before anyone else did. Treat a servant well, and you gained eyes and ears. Treat them poorly, and you gained a future problem who smiled while memorizing your schedule. The smartest women understood that loyalty flowed downward before it flowed upward. Eunuchs were even more critical. They controlled access, timing, and information. Who entered which rooms, who waited, who was unavailable. A delayed message could ruin a plan. A conveniently delivered one could save a career. Maintaining good relations with eunuchs wasn't optional. It was infrastructure. Alliances were rarely permanent. Circumstances changed. Favor shifted. People adapted. Loyalty in the harem was situational, not sentimental. Today's ally could be tomorrow's liability, and yesterday's enemy might suddenly become very useful. The trick was never appearing surprised. What made these alliances so effective was their invisibility. On the surface, the harem ran on rules and hierarchy. Beneath that surface, it ran on relationships. Official rank mattered, but informal networks mattered more. The women who lasted longest were those who understood both systems and knew when to rely on each. And of course, alliances were tested constantly. A scandal would break, a favor would be denied, someone would fall ill at a suspiciously inconvenient time. Each event forced alliances to reveal themselves, often unintentionally. Who defended whom? Who stayed silent? Who suddenly remembered an urgent appointment elsewhere? The most dangerous alliances were the quietest ones. Two people who never spoke publicly. Three who never appeared together. A network that looked accidental, but moved with precision. These were not friendships. They were insurance policies. In the Ottoman Harem, no one survived alone. But no one trusted completely either. Alliances were built not on affection, but on mutual understanding of one simple truth. Today's stability depended on tomorrow's discretion, and discretion here was worth more than gold. In the Ottoman Harem, scandals rarely began with passion and almost never ended with truth. What outsiders labeled scandal was usually politics wearing a dramatic disguise. Affairs, rivalries, sudden accusations. These were not random explosions of emotion. They were symptoms of power shifting under pressure. Rumors were the most efficient weapon. They required no proof, no witnesses, and no direct confrontation. A well-placed whisper could do more damage than an open accusation, especially in an environment where reputation was everything and defense was risky. Denying a rumor meant acknowledging it. Ignoring it meant letting it grow. Either way, someone benefited, and it was rarely the person being discussed. Poisoning accusations were especially popular, largely because they were impossible to prove conclusively and deeply unsettling. A sudden illness didn't need to be fatal to raise suspicion. A few days of weakness, a misappearance, a delayed recovery, all of it invited speculation. And speculation in the Harem spread faster than facts ever could. What made these scandals effective was timing. Accusations didn't appear randomly. They surfaced when a woman gained influence, when her child advanced, or when her allies became visible. Scandal was not about morality. It was about interruption, slowing someone down, forcing them into defense, making them hesitate. Even minor breaches of etiquette could be weaponized. A gesture interpreted incorrectly, a phrase repeated out of context, a moment of visible frustration. These were not mistakes in a normal environment. In the Harem, they were opportunities. And then there was silence, the most damaging response of all. When a scandal emerged and no one rushed to defend the accused, that absence spoke loudly. Silence signaled isolation. Isolation invited removal. The Harem did not need trials or verdicts. Consensus formed quietly, and consequences followed naturally. What's striking is how rarely these scandals shocked the people inside the system. Outsiders were scandalized. Insiders were attentive. They watched reactions, measured responses, and updated their mental maps of power accordingly. Who survived? Who didn't? Who reappeared with diminished status? Who vanished entirely? In many cases, scandals weren't even meant to destroy someone permanently. Sometimes they were warnings, corrections, a reminder of limits, a way of saying you're moving too fast without saying anything at all. The Ottoman Harem did not punish chaos, it used it. And the most successful players were not those who avoided scandal entirely, but those who knew when it was coming and who had already positioned themselves to endure it. In the Ottoman Harem, emotion was never just emotion. It was leverage. And nowhere was this more obvious than in letters, carefully written, meticulously timed, and never as spontaneous as they pretended to be. Love letters were not private confessions. They were instruments. Writing to the Sultan was a privilege, not a habit. Paper, wording, tone, and even handwriting were scrutinized long before the message ever reached its destination. A letter that sounded too desperate suggested instability. One that sounded too confident suggested arrogance. And one that sounded too intelligent risked reminding the reader that you were in fact thinking, which was dangerous. The most effective letters appeared effortless, warm, respectful, emotionally restrained. They expressed devotion without clinging, concern without complaint, affection without demand. This balance was difficult to achieve, which is why it worked so well. Anyone could write a dramatic plea. Very few could write something that felt sincere and non-threatening at the same time. Timing mattered even more than content. A letter sent after a victory felt supportive. One sent during uncertainty felt manipulative. One sent at the wrong moment could undo years of careful positioning. And once sent, a letter could not be unsent. It could be reread, quoted, remembered, or conveniently misremembered. What made letters especially dangerous was that they created records. Spoken words vanished. Written words lingered. A single phrase could be interpreted generously or maliciously, depending on who was holding the paper. And papers, as it turned out, had legs. They traveled. They were shared quietly. They appeared unexpectedly in conversations you were not part of. Letters also created intimacy, or at least the illusion of it. A woman who wrote well could feel present, even when physically absent. She could remind the Sultan of her existence without appearing to demand attention. This was subtle influence, and subtle influence was the most effective kind. Of course, letters could backfire. Too many letters suggested desperation. Too few suggested indifference. Silence could be read as dignity or disloyalty, depending on the political climate that week. There was no safe number, only calculated risk. The true skill was writing a letter that sounded personal while remaining politically harmless. A message that could be reread by others without causing alarm. A letter that revealed warmth but concealed ambition. In the Ottoman Harem, love letters were not about love. They were about presence, and presence in a system built on distance, and restriction was power. Especially when it arrived folded neatly, sealed carefully, and read in private. If power in the Ottoman harem flowed quietly, then the eunuchs were the valves. They did not make laws. They did not give speeches. They did not sit on thrones. And yet they controlled something far more dangerous. Access. Who entered, who waited, who was unavailable, and who was never seen again, but in a perfectly respectable way. Officially, eunuchs were guardians tasked with maintaining order, security, and propriety. Unofficially, they were the human infrastructure of the harem. Corridors passed through them. Messages passed through them. Time itself seemed to slow or accelerate depending on their decisions. A message delivered immediately could change a career. The same message delayed could quietly end one. A visitor turned away politely might assume bad timing. A visitor turned away repeatedly began to understand that timing was not the issue. Eunuchs knew everything without appearing to know anything. They heard conversations they were not meant to react to. They observed expressions they were not meant to comment on. They remembered who was calm under pressure and who smiled too quickly when things went wrong. Memory was their greatest weapon, and they used it sparingly. What made eunuchs particularly powerful was their permanence. Women rose and fell. Favorites changed. Princes grew up or disappeared. Eunuchs remained. They outlasted trends, alliances, and reputations. They saw patterns where others saw moments. Smart women cultivated respect with eunuchs, not through flattery, which was transparent, but through consistency, courtesy, restraint, predictability. You did not want a eunuch guessing your intentions. You wanted them understanding them quietly and finding them acceptable. And of course, eunuchs talked to each other. Information traveled laterally. A problem in one wing of the harem could be anticipated in another before it officially existed. A woman who offended the wrong eunuch didn't receive punishment. She received inconvenience, which in the harem was far worse. The most dangerous thing about eunuch power was how invisible it was. No accusations, no confrontations, just doors that stopped opening, invitations that failed to arrive, messages that somehow never reached their destination. By the time someone realized access had been restricted, the damage was already done. In the Ottoman harem, power did not belong only to those who spoke. It belonged to those who decided when others were allowed to speak. And the eunuchs, standing quietly in the corridors, understood that better than anyone. The Ottoman harem did not rely on guards alone to maintain order. It relied on walls, doors, corridors, angles. Architecture did half the policing, so people didn't have to look rude while doing it. This was not accidental design. This was strategy in stone. The harem was built as a maze, not the fun kind with a prize at the end, but the exhausting kind where every turn makes you second guesses your sense of direction and your life choices. Corridors bent unexpectedly. Courtyards were enclosed and isolated. Doors led somewhere, just not where you thought. You could live inside the harem for years and still not know how to reach certain sections, which of course was the point. Separation was the first layer of control. Women of different ranks lived apart. Servants slept elsewhere. Anuk occupied strategic thresholds like human punctuation marks. Movement required permission, timing, and often supervision. Wandering was discouraged politely, but firmly. Getting lost wasn't dangerous, but it was memorable. And being memorable for the wrong reason was never wise. Visibility was the second layer. Some rooms were designed to be watched without their occupants realizing it. Screens, lattices, and angled openings allowed observation without interaction. You could be seen without seeing back, which is a deeply unsettling way to exist. It taught people to behave as if someone was always watching, because someone usually was. Sound mattered, too. Thick walls muffled conversations, but not entirely. Voices carried just enough to remind you that privacy was fragile. People learned to speak softly, or not at all. Whispering became a skill. Silence became a language. Even comfort was controlled. Rooms varied in size, light, and decoration based on rank. Advancement came with better surroundings. Decline came with dimmer rooms and fewer visitors. No announcement was necessary. Your environment told the story for you. The brilliance of this system was its subtlety. No one needed to shout orders. The building itself encouraged compliance. You didn't need to be told where you belonged. You felt it. And when someone was removed from favor, the architecture did that too. Relocation to a distant wing, a quieter courtyard, fewer intersections with important people. The harem didn't exile you dramatically. It simply placed you somewhere you no longer mattered. In the Ottoman Harem, power wasn't only enforced by people. It was embedded in the walls. And walls, unlike rivals, never forgot their purpose. Not every intrigue in the Ottoman harem ended in dramatic collapse. There were no public trials, no shouted accusations, no doors slammed for emphasis. More often than not, punishment arrived softly, wrapped in politeness, and carried out with impeccable manners. Exile was the preferred solution, and not the dramatic kind where someone is dragged away at dawn. This was the refined version, the kind where you were informed gently that you would be relocating to another palace, somewhere pleasant, somewhere quiet, somewhere very far from relevance. At first, exile didn't look like punishment at all. The new residence was comfortable. The servants were polite. The food was adequate. Everything you needed was provided. Everything except influence, which inconveniently had been the whole point. This kind of exile was designed to confuse. Was it mercy? Was it protection? Was it temporary? The uncertainty was intentional. Uncertainty kept people compliant. Complaining would appear ungrateful. Questioning would look suspicious. Silence was the safest response, and silence, over time, erased you. Once removed from the center, information stopped flowing. You no longer heard the latest rumors. You no longer received updates about shifting alliances. Messages arrived late, if at all. Your name stopped appearing in conversations you weren't part of anymore. And gradually, everyone adjusted to your absence. The genius of this punishment was that it required no violence and left no scandal. Outsiders saw stability. Insiders saw a warning. Everyone understood the message. You had crossed a line, and the system had corrected itself. Exile also served another purpose. It preserved the illusion of harmony. No one needed to explain why you were gone. No one needed to admit conflict. History prefers neat stories, and exile provided one. You didn't fall. You simply faded. Some women tried to return. A few succeeded, usually after years of patience and careful reentry. Most did not. Time worked against them. New faces filled the space they once occupied. New alliances formed. The harem moved on efficiently, as it always did. What made exile especially effective was how ordinary it appeared. No one whispered about it. No one dramatized it. It simply happened. And because it happened so often, it normalized disappearance. In the Ottoman Harem, removal didn't require cruelty. It required distance. And distance, applied slowly and politely, accomplished what force never could. It made people forget you mattered at all. At a certain point, even the most determined historians had to admit something uncomfortable. The Ottoman Empire was being influenced, steered, and occasionally outright managed by women who officially did not rule anything at all. This era would later be labeled the Sultanate of Women, a name that made chroniclers uneasy and modern readers suspicious. Both excellent signs that something important was happening. This wasn't a sudden revolution. No banners were raised. No men were overthrown dramatically. Instead, power slid sideways, quietly, bureaucratically, through advice, access, and timing. Women inside the harem began shaping decisions not by issuing orders, but by influencing the people who did. Mothers of sultans advised sons who trusted them. Wives and favorites shaped moods, priorities, and perceptions. A suggestion framed as concern carried more weight than a command ever could. And because these women were excluded from formal authority, their influence often went unrecorded, which made it easier to deny and harder to stop. This unsettled officials deeply. Power that couldn't be publicly acknowledged, couldn't be openly challenged. How do you oppose someone who technically doesn't exist in the chain of command? You don't. You work around them cautiously and hope they're in a good mood. Foreign ambassadors noticed it too. They complained in letters that negotiations depended less on official meetings and more on who had access behind the scenes. Decisions delayed suddenly moved forward. Obstacles vanished without explanation. The harem, it turned out, was a very effective place to resolve problems quietly. Of course, this influence was fragile. It depended on relationships, not titles. A change of ruler could erase years of positioning overnight. Women who had guided policy found themselves sidelined when the political climate shifted. Power gained informally could be lost just as easily. Still, for decades, women inside the harem played decisive roles in succession, diplomacy, religious patronage, and internal stability. They funded mosques, schools, and charities, acts that shaped public life, even when their names were omitted from official praise. The scandal wasn't that women influenced the empire. The scandal was how uncomfortable everyone felt admitting it. The Sultanate of women didn't break the Ottoman system. It revealed how flexible and how dependent on quiet intelligence that system already was. And once you see that, the harem stops looking like a sideshow and starts looking like the control room it had been all along. When Europeans wrote about the Ottoman harem, they did so with confidence, imagination, and absolutely no access. This combination proved disastrous. Lacking first-hand knowledge, they filled the gaps with fantasy, moral panic, and a deep conviction that anything unfamiliar must also be corrupt. To European observers, the harem looked like everything their own societies warned against. Women near power, secrecy instead of transparency, influence without titles. This was unsettling. So rather than ask how it worked, they decided it must be decadent. It was easier that way. Travel accounts described excess indulgence and uncontrolled desire, usually written by men who had never set foot inside the harem and never would. These stories circulated enthusiastically because nothing sells like scandal you can't verify. Over time, exaggeration hardened into fact, and the harem became a moral cautionary tale rather than a political institution. There was also jealousy involved. European courts liked to believe their power structures were rational and orderly, even while collapsing regularly due to infighting, incompetence, and spectacularly bad marriages. The idea that the Ottomans managed succession and influence through controlled seclusion felt suspiciously effective and deeply uncomfortable. Gender played a major role, too. European writers struggled to accept that women could exercise power without chaos. In their minds, female influence was either invisible or disastrous. The harem contradicted both assumptions. It demonstrated restraint, discipline, and long-term strategy, qualities Europeans preferred to assign to men with swords. So the harem was reduced to a caricature, a place of indulgence instead of governance, pleasure instead of planning, desire instead of discipline. This narrative conveniently reassured European audiences that whatever problems they had, at least they weren't that strange. Meanwhile, the Ottomans continued running an empire that lasted centuries longer than many of its critic states. Not perfectly, not peacefully, but effectively. The misunderstanding wasn't accidental. It was useful. By portraying the harem as scandalous, Europeans avoided confronting a system that didn't match their assumptions. A system where influence wasn't loud, where power wasn't always visible, and where women played roles that history preferred to minimize. Europe didn't misunderstand the harem because it lacked information. It misunderstood it because understanding would have been inconvenient, and inconvenient truths rarely survive first contact with confident ignorance. After all the whispers, rivalries, exiles, alliances, letters, corridors, and carefully managed silences, the greatest intrigue of the Ottoman harem isn't what happened inside it. It's what history chose not to see. For centuries, historians treated the harem like background noise, an exotic distraction running parallel to real politics, which conveniently took place wherever men happened to be standing at the time. Decisions made publicly were recorded. Decisions made quietly were dismissed as scandal, emotion, or coincidence. And so, an entire system of influence was quietly edited out of the story. But empires are not held together by proclamations alone. They are held together by access, timing, restraint, and the ability to shape outcomes without appearing to do so. The Ottoman harem excelled at all four. Nothing inside it was accidental, not the education, not the hierarchy, not the isolation, not the punishments that looked like kindness. Every mechanism existed to manage succession, prevent chaos, and control proximity to power. It was not perfect. It was not humane by modern standards, but it was functional. And functionality, in imperial terms, matters more than morality. The women inside the harem were not passive figures drifting through luxury. They were participants in a system that demanded awareness, patience, and self-control. Some failed. Some survived quietly. Some shaped the empire in ways that only become visible when you stop looking for loud authority and start paying attention to patterns. The scandals, too, deserve rethinking. They were not evidence of excess. They were signs of pressure. When power concentrates, tension follows. And when tension builds in a sealed environment, it releases through rumor, maneuvering, and quiet removal rather than open revolt. The harem did not create intrigue. It contained it. Perhaps that is why it made outsiders uncomfortable. The harem proved that influence did not always announce itself. That control did not require spectacle. That power could exist behind screens, behind etiquette, behind politeness so refined it looked harmless. And maybe that's the real scandal. Not that the Ottoman harem was full of intrigue, but that it worked as intended, quietly shaping one of the most durable empires in history, while the world pretended it was just decoration. So when you hear the word harem, remember this. You're not looking at a fantasy. You're looking at a system. And systems don't need to be loud to be powerful. Matilda of Tuscany was born in 1046 into a world where land mattered more than titles and borders were drawn with swords rather than ink. Her family, the House of Cosa, controlled a vast chain of territories stretching from Lameti down through Tuscany and into the Apennine Mountains. These lands were not just rich, they were strategic. Whoever ruled them controlled the main routes between Germany and Rome. Every emperor marching south, every pope traveling north passed through Matilda's future inheritance. From the moment she was born, she stood at the crossroads of Europe's most dangerous power struggle. Her father, Boniface of Tuscany, was one of the most powerful nobles in Italy, feared and respected in equal measure. Her mother, Beatrice of Lorraine, came from imperial blood and understood court politics as well as battlefield realities. This was not a household that trained daughters for embroidery and silence. Matilda grew up surrounded by soldiers, envoys, priests, and messengers. She heard strategy discussed at the dinner table. She saw disputes settled with force. Violence was not abstract. It was administrative. When Matilda was still a child, her father was assassinated. The murder shattered the balance of power overnight. Enemies moved quickly, hoping to seize Cossan lands before the family could respond. Instead, Matilda's mother stepped forward and held the territories together with sheer political will. From her, Matilda learned an early lesson. Authority was something you took and defended, not something politely granted. Her education reflected this reality. She was trained in Latin, theology, and law, but also learned how estates functioned, how armies were supplied, and how loyalty was purchased or enforced. Chroniclers later noted her unusual discipline and seriousness, even as a girl. While other noble children were sent away, Matilda stayed close to the machinery of power, watching decisions being made in real time. By adolescence, she had already witnessed betrayal, assassination, and the constant tension between empire and church. She learned that neutrality was a fantasy and that choosing a side was inevitable. Every road her family controlled made her a target. Every fortress made her indispensable. Before Matilda ever wore armor or commanded troops, she had already been shaped by a brutal truth. Survival in medieval Europe depended on understanding power before it crushed you. Matilda of Tuscany entered adulthood under immense pressure, not because she lacked authority, but because her authority made others nervous. Powerful women in medieval Europe were tolerated only if they could be controlled. The solution, as always, was marriage. In 1089, Matilda was wed to Wal V of Bavaria, a much younger noble from a powerful German family. On paper, the match was brilliant. It tied Italian lands to German aristocracy and promised stability between empire and church-aligned territories. In reality, it was a political miscalculation that exposed how little Matilda was willing to surrender. The marriage was never equal. Matilda was older, wealthier, vastly more experienced, and already ruling in her own right. Wealth, barely out of adolescence, arrived not as a partner, but as a symbol. Imperial supporters hoped the marriage would tame her independence and pull Tuscany closer to the emperor's orbit. What they misunderstood was that Matilda did not share power easily, especially with someone who brought ambition, but no understanding of Italian politics. Sources describe the union as distant almost from the beginning. They lived apart for long stretches, governed separately, and pursued different loyalties. Wealth was tied to German interests and imperial expectations. Matilda was already drifting firmly toward the reformist papacy, which sought to strip emperors of control over church appointments. The marriage became less a bond and more a fault line. By the early 1090s, the relationship collapsed entirely. There were no children, no reconciliation, and no dramatic court scandal. The separation was quiet but decisive. Matilda returned fully to her lands and her responsibilities, shedding the last expectation that she would rule through a husband. In a society where female power was often justified only through male guardianship, this was a radical move. The failed marriage clarified something essential about Matilda's character. She was willing to accept alliances when they strengthened her position, but she would not allow them to dilute her authority. Marriage for her was a tool, not an identity. When it stopped serving its purpose, she abandoned it without regret. From this point forward, Matilda ruled alone. No consort, no regent, no intermediary. The separation freed her politically and psychologically, allowing her to act decisively as conflict between pope and emperor intensified. She was no longer someone's wife managing estates in the background. She was a ruler preparing for open confrontation, fully aware that the next choices she made would place her directly in the path of emperors. Matilda of Tuscany reached the defining crossroads of her life as Europe descended into the investiture controversy, a conflict that went far beyond church ritual and struck at the heart of political authority. At its core was a simple but explosive question: who had the right to appoint bishops and abbots, the Pope or the Emperor? For Matilda, neutrality was impossible. Her lands sat between Rome and Germany, and whichever side she chose would use Tuscany as a highway or a battlefield. She chose the papacy. Matilda aligned herself with Pope Gregory VIII, a fierce reformer who believed the church must be free from imperial control. This decision was not symbolic. It was logistical. She offered the Pope protection, resources, safe passage, and fortresses. Her castles became papal strongholds. Her roads became lifelines. Without her support, reformist popes would have been dangerously exposed in northern Italy. Her choice immediately made her an enemy of Emperor Henry, VTH. To the imperial court, Matilda was no longer a noble woman exercising independence. She was a threat, a landholder powerful enough to block armies, disrupt supply lines, and shelter excommunicated popes. Henry responded with propaganda, pressure, and eventually open hostility. Tuscany became a front line, not because Matilda sought war, but because her position made war inevitable. The most famous moment of this struggle came in 1077 at Cosa. After being excommunicated, Henry crossed the Alps in winter to seek absolution from the Pope. Gregory took refuge in Matilda's fortress. For 3 days, the emperor stood barefoot in the snow outside the castle walls, waiting for forgiveness. The image became legend, but the reality was colder. Matilda had engineered the setting. She controlled the castle, the negotiations, and the security. An emperor humbled at her gate was not an accident. From that moment on, reconciliation was impossible. Henry regained strength and returned with force, invading Italy and stripping Matilda of lands when he could. She responded not by retreating, but by reorganizing defenses, rallying loyal nobles, and preparing for prolonged conflict. Her rule shifted from administration to resistance. By choosing the Pope, Matilda did more than take a religious stance. She declared that emperors could be opposed, stalled, and even humiliated by a determined regional power. She placed herself at the center of Europe's most dangerous ideological war, and made it clear she had no intention of stepping aside. Matilda of Tuscany did not support the papacy from behind monastery walls. When war came, she fought it directly. As Emperor Henry VTH pushed into northern Italy, Matilda transformed her territories into a defensive network designed to exhaust, confuse, and bleed imperial forces. Her power did not rely on one grand army, but on geography. Hilltop castles, narrow passes, and fortified towns became weapons in her hands. She personally oversaw the strengthening of fortifications across Tuscany and Emilia. Chroniclers describe her riding between strongholds, inspecting defenses, organizing supplies, and coordinating commanders. This was not ceremonial leadership. She understood siege warfare, logistics, and timing. She knew when to defend and when to withdraw, when to engage, and when to let terrain do the killing. Imperial armies struggled not because they lacked soldiers, but because they could not move freely through her lands. Matilda's role as a military leader unsettled contemporaries. Medieval society had scripts for queens and countesses, but not for women directing campaigns. Yet, no source suggests her authority was challenged by her troops. Loyalty came from competence. She paid soldiers, fed them, and protected their families. Nobles followed her because she controlled fortresses and could reward faithfulness or punish betrayal decisively. Battles during this period were rarely clean or heroic. They were ambushes, scorched fields, sabotaged bridges, and prolonged sieges. Matilda excelled at this kind of war. When imperial forces advanced, she denied them food and shelter. When they retreated, she harassed them relentlessly. The war became one of endurance, and Matilda had the advantage of fighting on familiar ground. Her most significant victory came in 1092, when imperial forces suffered a crushing defeat in the Enns. The loss shattered Henry's momentum in Italy and proved that Matilda was not merely obstructive. She was capable of destroying imperial armies outright. The defeat echoed across Europe, reinforcing the idea that emperors were not invincible on Italian soil. This phase of Matilda's life marked her full transformation from noble patron to war leader. She was no longer just the protector of popes. She was the architect of imperial failure in Italy. Every castle that held, every road thaw,